What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So, in this video, I just want to talk about something that I noticed is discussed a lot on social media, sometimes on television, sometimes even here on YouTube. Um, we talk about it. We all have opinions on it, and that's the fact that uh, when often we're talking about different players and we're debating different things, we will bring up the era that they played in. And I guess that's the way of us judging how strong a player is. We'll say, well, this player was in that era, then this player would be able to do this. This player was in that era, they would dominate. And a lot of that comes off our own personal bias. I'm not gonna lie about that. We all have biases. But I think that if you're really honest, if you're really honest about certain things, you'll note that every era has something that you can praise and something that you can criticize about it. You know what I'm saying? Starting from the 1940s on up. Now, we all criticize the 1940s. Like, I mean, we don't respect it. Uh, the skill set was horrid compared to today. The average height was probably 6'1", 6'2", maybe 170 pounds. I mean, these guys would be midgets compared to players today. These guys probably wouldn't even make it into some high schools. But they wouldn't even make it in high schools today, actually. Like the skill set was very primitive. Defenses, offenses, these guys still took set shots. All right. Um, and of course, there was still that unofficial color line. There were no black players in the NBA in 1940. But you know what? But I got to say this, though. Despite all of that, they still helped to create the NBA. If the league had failed, then there might have been another professional basketball league for many years. You know, but who knows if it would have been successful. So I still give them that. I still give them, you know, respect as pioneers of basketball, even though all these negative things were in place at that time. Now, in the 1950s, you did start seeing some, appearances of black players uh, pre Bill Russell, but these guys, they were still sort of, I hate to use this word, but they were tokens. Like in practice, they'd probably be kicking the ass of the so-called star player on their team, but in actual games, they weren't getting any play. That was just to appease the pressure put upon them due to, Major League Baseball integrating, in boxing, of course, you had since Joe Louis era integration. They didn't have a color line in boxing, or so basketball for the pressure for that. You actually started seeing people that resemble real centers like George Mikan. Instead of having guys that were 5'11", 6'1", 6'2" play center, now you had guys who were actually above average in height, 6'5", 6'7", then maybe 6'8", 6'9". I mean, they were getting bigger. I mean, it was the league was progressing. Okay, you started seeing offensive and defensive goaltending rules put in play. The 3-second violation rule was implemented since 1936. Shot clock violation, excuse me, the shot clock was implemented in 1954. I don't know why every time I always talk about the shot clock, sometimes I say shot clock violation. Like, why do I say that? I don't know why I keep saying that all the time. But the shot clock was I guess it's because here in the games, shot clock violation. But the shot clock was implemented in 1954 to speed the game up. Before that, the average scores were in the 60s, 70s. Now the games, these guys are scoring over 100 points a game. So it's starting to resemble the game today. But there was still too much prejudice going on as far as team owners and not wanting to play black players. For that, I do think Bill Russell. Um, the game was still primitive. Guys were still taking set shots. And, the game was still inferior to what we see today. Now, in the 1960s, you were seeing a definite improvement. All of these old guys, they were gone for the most part. You saw a new generation of players: Wilt Chamberlain, Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, Jack Twyman. You know, you started seeing new great players who were more skilled, more fundamentally sound. Um, you started actually seeing athletes playing. Elgin Baylor, guys that, even though the dunk was still frowned upon, um, the game was becoming more and more of the art form that we saw today, that we see today, or in recent years. I put it like that, modern day. So yeah, the league was going to a great place. If you love scoring, you would have loved the 1960s. It was the highest scoring era in the history of the NBA. 1961-62 season was infamous for scoring. Wilt averaged 50 that year. Elgin Baylor averaged 38. Um, I believe Walt Bellamy was a rookie. He averaged 31, almost 32 points a game. Like, scoring was way up in that era. The average team, I think teams were averaging 118 points a night. Some teams were averaging over 120 points per game. All right. And that's one thing I want to criticize about that era. Some of those points, some of that scoring was super inflated. Um, Bill Russell, career averages of 14 points and 22.5 rebounds. Sounds absolutely phenomenal as far as the rebounds concerned. But if you actually watch game footage, Bill Russell was not a particularly skilled offensive rebounder. He was great at defensive rebounds, but he was not a particularly skilled offensive rebounder. Some of his offensive rebounds were him putting back missed shots and him being bigger and more athletic than everybody else at the time. Um, but if you translate his numbers to today, he would probably average more like 12 points and maybe, I'd say, 14 rebounds. Still great numbers, but not legendary. You know, maybe 15. He would be battling like Andre Drummond. I think he and Wilt would be battling Andre Drummond, probably a little bit ahead of him most of the years in rebounding, but they probably averaging like, well, actually, when I look at pace, yeah, they're probably averaging about 15 rebounds a game. Now I think about it. But yeah, the pace still inflated these guys' numbers. The one area where pace didn't inflate their numbers was in assists. We noticed points were higher, rebounds were higher, but assists were not really all that high. Like, Oscar Robertson averaged maybe 9 assists, 9.5. So why were assists not all that high? Because back then, the NBA was a lot more stringent on what an assist was. If you did not shoot the ball in one motion after a guy passed it to you, then it was not a registered assist. Dribble the ball at any time, in any way, if you made some type of offensive move, if it did not immediately lead to a made shot, then it was not considered an assist. So in today's world, Oscar Robertson would have registered a lot more official assists. And therefore, theoretically, he would have registered even more triple doubles than he actually did. Another criticism I want to say of the 1960s is the Russell dynasty. Now, true, with there only being 8 to 14 teams during that time, it is true that with the dilution of talent, there's more talented players. Okay, that's true. All right, but peep this out though. Yeah, with only 8 to 14 teams, without more teams diluting talent, every team has more all stars, more great players. The problem is Bill Russell played with 12 Hall of Famers. Okay, 12 great players during his 13-year career. Lack of free agency, the way the rules were. In today's world, there's no way in hell the Boston Celtics would have been able to afford all those great players. Back then, yep, they could. Um, and also, these guys didn't really have the choice to be able to just leave and do all that. They didn't have all that back then. All right. But look, let's say 8 teams, right? So that's 4 teams per conference. So let's say the playoffs, right? Playoffs happen, and the top 3 teams go to the playoffs. The bottom one is shit out of luck. The Celtics get a bye from being the top seed. They get a bye back then. They had a bye in some of those years. They didn't have to play like in football. The next 2 teams, they battle out. They battle it out, right? Then whoever wins that series has to play Boston. Then Boston, only playing one damn round, beat that team, and then beat whoever come out of the West. You know what I'm saying? Play whoever come out of the West and then beat them. And then some years, Boston just plays the top 2 teams, or the top 2 teams come out. Then Boston beat that team, go to the finals, and play whoever is in the Western Conference in the finals. That's not a really rigorous, stretch. That's not a really rigorous defensive title. It's not like grinding out 4 different rounds like the modern day teams. It's a lot of things you could point out, man, but I don't want to sound like I'm hating on Bill Russell, man. It's era too much. But there are certain things, like I said, that you could point out with every era. In the 70s, okay? Me personally, I love the 70s. There's a lot of parity. We didn't have any defending champions, right? But this is a knock on the 70s. The ABA. In the ABA, you had a lot of players who would be over in the NBA, but they went over and played in the ABA. So that's diluting the talent pool of the NBA tremendously. Now, there's some other stuff you could talk about, but I don't want to really go into ratings. That has nothing really to do with basketball per se. That's just fan taste. But yeah, the actual talent competition, that's something that's real big, that that you criticize. Now, one of the things that you have to say positive about the '70s is, despite all that, still the level of competition, the center position was still great. You know what I'm saying? And that's why you know Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is still considered the greatest center because of the level of competition he played at that position. And then even with that, as the ABA folded, those guys went back over to the NBA and still were presenting as opposition to Kareem, and he still was the best center in the league for the most part in that decade. But that's just something you could say about the '70s. Now the '80s is considered the gold standard, right? It's the best, just every team was great, and everybody played perfect. All right. Now, look, I think that the '80s was the best as far as pure talent per team. Like even the bad teams had all-star level players on them. You know what I'm saying? But there's some stuff you can criticize. Number one, okay, um, look, a lot of people get on LeBron James about him going to the finals every year in the 2000 teams, right? Because the Eastern Conference is weak. The Eastern Conference was weak. The Eastern Conference was weak. The Eastern Conference is so weak, right? People criticize, the East now for being weak. But one of the big criticisms of the Western Conference in the '80s was that it was, especially the first 6, 7 years of the '80s, is that it was weak compared to the Eastern Conference. And that was true until the late '80s, and then it was a real surge in talent in the West. Okay, but yeah, that was pretty damn true. Look, in 1981, the Lakers lost to the Houston Rockets, largely because of Moses Malone, who at that time was the most dominant player in the league. Right, he carried that Houston Rockets team on his back. That team had a losing record. That year, the Western Conference Finals was the only year in the history of the NBA we had two teams with losing records in the conference. It was the Houston Rockets and the Kansas City Kings, both 40 and 42. And that Kings team had a roster that consisted of, who was on that team? Maybe somebody like Phil Ford, an aging Sam Lacey, Otis Birdsong. Now, I'm not saying that they're bad players, but they aren't exactly the creme of the creme of the creme of the NBA. So yeah, you know, you can make that criticism of the '80s. Another thing is that people like to use this term super team, but in reality, throughout the '80s, there were really only five super teams. To me, they were the Lakers, they were the Celtics, later on the Pistons, the Sixers, and the team that many people don't bring up, Milwaukee. Milwaukee was a really good team. Milwaukee is the best team in the '80s not to make it to an NBA final. You know what I'm saying? Really look at those Milwaukee Bucks teams. They were tremendous. They just couldn't get past Philly and Boston. You know, they couldn't get past Philly and Boston in the playoffs. But if you weren't on any of those teams, you weren't going to championship. Now, I'm not saying that those other teams didn't have talent. They did. Denver had talent. The Spurs had talent. Um, Eventually, the Bulls would become a really good team. Um, the Rockets had some great players. Uh, you know, the Golden State Warriors pre TMC had some good teams with Purvis Short and Sleepy Floyd and Joe Barry Carroll. But at the end of the day, if you weren't part of those four teams, with that 15 being a sleeper, you didn't really have any title hopes. No. So those are some things that you could say about the '80s. You know. Also, in 1979, the NBA got rid of hand checking, which people may not know, but the league didn't really enforce it. You know what I'm saying? Like they didn't really enforce it. So technically, hand checking had been eliminated for over 40 years, but guys were still doing it. You know what I'm saying? Now the '90s, look, I get it. That's the era of the Bulls. People love the Bulls. 6 championships. It's It's all great. All right. But to be objective, you got to be able to look at certain things, look at things people criticize, and see if there's some merit in it. It is true that the Bulls never faced in the finals a team for dominant center. And one of the biggest what ifs of all time is would the Bulls have been able to beat the Rockets with Hakeem Olajuwon in the finals? Now, I like to think they would have, but the Bulls did struggle against the Rockets in the regular season prior to Jordan's retirement. I think there was something like 1-9 or 1-8 or something to that effect. That'd be 1-9, maybe 1-8, maybe Olajuwon missed a game or something. But they were 1-9 or something like that in games against the Rockets. I know it was an atrocious record, maybe 2-9 or two. It was something terrible. That doesn't necessarily always translate to postseason success. In 1989, the Bulls were 0-6 against the Cavaliers that year, but the Bulls still beat them in the first round. So it doesn't necessarily translate to the playoffs. So that doesn't necessarily mean that much, but they would have given the Bulls some problems. But that's the criticism. The Bulls never faced a team in the finals with a dominant center. But at the same time, the Bulls did beat some teams in the Eastern Conference with dominant centers. Alonzo Mourning, Shaquille O'Neal, Patrick Ewing. So, I think that's more of wishful thinking than anything, but yeah, it's a fact. And then, look, it is true that by the mid to late 90s, the NBA was starting to become watered down. Okay? It's true. The league was continuing to expand throughout the 80s into the 90s. You had the additions of the Miami Heat, then the Minnesota Timberwolves, then Orlando Magic, then the mid 90s Toronto Raptors, then the Vancouver Grizzlies. This is fine. This is good. You know what I'm saying? Um, a lot of these teams, especially Toronto and Minnesota, they actually used to all have NBA franchises. Toronto Huskies, Minnesota, or Minneapolis Lakers. So that was the NBA trying to rebring basketball to these former NBA cities in a lot of these cases. It's a good thing. They want to expand basketball to the state of Florida. It's a good thing, okay? But from a competitive standpoint, it was diluting basketball. Okay, it was further diluting basketball, and it was bringing basketball opportunities to players who otherwise would not have been good enough to play in the NBA. That's a bad thing. Another thing that happened is by the mid 1990s, you started seeing more and more draft busts. Like for every Allen Iverson, you were seeing more Joe Smiths and Michael Olowokandis, Ed O'Bannon. You're seeing more of these busts, and it became much more frequent in the 2000s. And as you segue from the 90s, into the 2000s, you started seeing this trend of scoring dropping every year. Um, 89, 90, the average team might have been scoring about 111 points. By 93, that might have dropped to 108, 95, it was down to 100, you know, maybe 103. By the late 90s, scoring had dropped below 100 in Jordan's last year, and you started seeing this segue into this defensive era, um, where teams were slugging it out, and these teams were struggling to score 90 points. Now, to me, in my personal opinion, I love that brand of basketball because it separated true scorers from shooters, guys who could actually put the ball on the floor guys who actually had a litany of moves, like an arsenal, things that they could go into their bag when defenses really had tough guys who had a variety of moves. Those were the real scorers, and not a lot of these catch and shoot guys you got today were putting up numbers. You couldn't do that back in those days. Even though technically hand checking was illegal, they were still allowing it. Even in the mid '90s, when they got rid of actual hand checking, guys were still being physical, using their elbows. You know what I'm saying? Knocking guys off stride, hitting them with the shoulder, their hips. We all know what they were doing back then. It was still a physical game. It was getting more physical actually by 2000. There's some good things you can say about this era though. Zone was implemented, so you really had to have skills. Okay, like honestly, when you look at the early 2000s, you can make an argument that that was the most difficult era to score in because right after they implemented zone, but before they began to open the game up with the rule changes, because the spacing wasn't really that great. Like if you look at some of those games from like 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, right into 2005, I think that's why a lot of those guys' shooting percentages were lower. So this is the problem a lot of people make when they try to say that the rule changes are exaggerated. You don't look at scoring average. Like they'll say, well, okay, if if the rule changes really made changes, then why this guy only went up 1 or 2 points? Just because they changed the rules doesn't mean these guys were going to shoot the ball more. What you got to look at is efficiency. There's a reason why Kobe Bryant went from shooting 43% in 2005 to shooting 45% in 2006, even though his shot attempts went way up because he averaged 35.4 points per game. There's a reason why AI went from shooting 38% to 44%. There's a reason why a guy like Paul Pierce might have went from shooting 46% to 48% because of the way that they opened the game up and defenses were now really handcuffed. They did away with the physicality. But, there are a lot of things you can criticize about the 2000s. But, you know, it was probably the most athletic era. And it was the last era of the hustle man, the last gasp of the hustle man. By that I mean players like the Roger Bells, George Lynch's, the Aaron McKees, you know, the Davis boys, like players that were respected for playing good defense and, you know, being scrappy. Today, these players will be considered unskilled. They couldn't shoot, you know what I'm saying? They had high basketball IQs, but the analytics would tell you that they're not good players. You know what I'm saying? Even though we all can look at the product today and say that one of the things missing is one of the key things that is missing is basketball IQ. A lot of these guys take bad shots. A lot of these guys make bad decisions out there, but because they shoot 40 blah 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 percent from three, and all they do is make layups and shoot threes, and the numbers tell you that hey, this game is great. You're just hating, whatever. So yeah, I don't have to go into the last two eras because it's too recent. We all know what the criticisms of the last couple of eras are, last 2 decades. But yeah, if you were to look at every decade, there's something that you can critique. The thing is, every great player would be great in any era. People, but at the end of the day, all of these players would be great in any respective era. You know, they will make adjustments, but you can put Mike Kobe, LeBron. Those are transcendent players that would be great in any era. You know, um, yeah, I might say if you put Curry in the '90s, he wouldn't average as many points. He wouldn't average 30, but that's not a knock on him because outside of Jordan, no other player really outside of him, let alone guard, was consistently averaging 30 points a game. You know, uh, I believe the highest scoring guard other than Michael in that decade was Mitch Richmond. I think his peak was 25. Yeah, 25. So that's not a knock on those guys. It's just the way the game was played, you know. But that's all I got to say, man. Tell me what you guys think.